The backyard was glowing softly under strings of golden lights that hung from tree to tree, swaying gently in the evening breeze as laughter rose and fell like music itself. And the air smelled of roses and fresh grass, the kind of scent that made a person breathe slower, deeper, feeling peace in every heartbeat. The couple had worked for weeks to make the day perfect, not a grand hall or expensive ballroom but their own home, their own garden, where every flower had been planted with care and every corner carried memories of love. Friends and family filled the chairs lined neatly across the yard, their voices cheerful, their faces glowing with happiness as they clapped for the bride who walked slowly toward the archway covered in white fabric and flowers, her dress simple but shining in the dim light, her smile trembling with joy. The groom stood tall, his eyes locked on her, his hands steady though inside he felt his chest burn with emotion. The music was soft, carried by a single violin player at the corner, notes floating into the night, mixing with the hum of laughter and whispers of congratulations. It was the kind of moment people dreamed of, small but perfect, private yet filled with love. But across the street, behind a window half covered with lace curtains, a pair of eyes glared with a bitterness that didn't belong in such a scene. HOA Karen, known by every neighbor for her constant complaints, her endless rules, her sharp voice and sharper glares, sat stiff in her chair, her lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. She muttered to herself about violations, about permits, about noise levels, about how the grass wasn't trimmed to regulation height, and how dare they think they could host an event without her approval. Her face twisted with every sound of laughter that floated across the street, every clap of joy, every note of the violin. She whispered words like disgrace, illegal, and unapproved gathering, as if the joy itself was breaking some written rule she alone could enforce. The neighbors knew her well enough to avoid her glare. They kept their distance, unwilling to cross the woman who had filed more complaints than anyone could count, who had taken photographs of trash cans left out 5 minutes late, who had fined people for flowers planted outside the regulation color scheme, who had threatened lawsuits over dogs barking too loudly. And now here she was, her eyes locked on the backyard wedding, her blood boiling hotter with each cheer. She rose from her chair, pacing, her hands trembling as though the happiness across the street was a personal attack against her order. The bride laughed with her guests, the groom kissed her hand, and the people clapped again. But Karen only muttered louder, her voice sharp and bitter in the quiet of her empty home. She picked up her phone from the table, staring at it for a long moment, her fingers twitching. She had done it before, called authorities on neighbors for smaller things. But this, she thought, this was different. This was a public violation. This was noise. This was against rules, and she could not let it pass. She convinced herself she was saving the neighborhood, protecting the peace, though inside she knew it was her jealousy that burned, her hatred of anyone else's joy when she had none of her own. She imagined the look on their faces when the police arrived, when the music was silenced, when the guests scattered in confusion, when the wedding was ruined. The thought made her lips curl into a smile, cold and satisfied, as if she had already won. She pressed the numbers on the phone slowly, savoring the act, 911, and held it to her ear as the line rang. Her voice shifted, no longer bitter but dripping with false panic, as she told the dispatcher there was a disturbance, a loud and disorderly gathering, too many people, maybe even dangerous. She could not feel safe in her own home, she said, exaggerating every word. Her tone carried the weight of lies wrapped in concern, convincing to someone who couldn't see the smug grin stretching across her face. Outside, the wedding continued, the vows beginning, the crowd falling quiet to hear the bride and groom speak words from their hearts, promises meant for a lifetime. The neighbors closer to Karen's home saw her standing at her window with the phone pressed to her ear, saw her nodding and pointing dramatically across the street even though nobody was watching. They shook their heads, whispering to themselves, too afraid to intervene, too tired of fighting her endless crusades. They knew what was happening, knew what she was doing, but they also knew it was too late. Karen hung up the phone, her heart racing not from fear but from excitement, the thrill of power buzzing in her veins. She paced back to her chair, sat down by the window, and leaned forward, her eyes locked on the backyard, waiting for the moment sirens would slice through the air. She imagined the scene clearly in her head, the officers stepping out, the bride's tears, the groom's frustration, the guests scattering like frightened birds. She muttered under her breath that rules must be followed, that people like them thought they were above order. But she would show them, she would show them all. The music continued, the vows carried on, and across the street joy bloomed brighter and brighter, while in the shadows Karen's face twisted further, her satisfaction poisoned with envy. The suspense hung heavy in the night, because no one at the wedding knew what was coming. No one knew that even now, the wheels were turning, that the sound of sirens would soon cut through their happiness, and that Karen, watching like a vulture, believed she had already destroyed their perfect day. Karen sat stiff in her chair with the phone pressed tightly against her ear, her voice dripping with fake urgency as she spoke to the dispatcher, each word carefully chosen to paint the backyard. Wedding as something dangerous, something illegal, something that needed immediate attention. She told them the music was loud, the guests were rowdy, the entire street was being disturbed, and that she felt unsafe in her own home, her tone trembling just enough to sound convincing though her lips curled into a satisfied smirk as she watched the guests laugh across the street. The dispatcher asked simple questions: how many people, what was happening, was there a threat, and Karen exaggerated every detail, saying there were dozens of strangers gathering, people she didn't recognize, cars blocking the street, loud noises that wouldn't stop, and perhaps even alcohol involved. She pretended her voice shook with fear, saying she was just a woman alone in her home, feeling overwhelmed, and the more she spoke, the more her excitement grew, because she knew the police would come quickly for something like this. She imagined the flashing lights already, imagined the bride's tears staining her makeup, the groom's frustration boiling as officers shut everything down, the guests scattering in confusion while she stood from her porch, the hero of the neighborhood, the one who enforced the rules when nobody else had the courage. As she spun her lies, her heart raced not with panic but with glee, a strange energy pulsing through her veins, because ruining joy gave her a satisfaction she never admitted to anyone, not even herself. The dispatcher told her officers were being sent, to remain calm, and she agreed sweetly, thanking them as if she were the victim, before ending the call and placing the phone gently on the table beside her. The silence that followed filled her with thrill, every second feeling like the ticking of a clock counting down to her victory. She leaned closer to the window, her eyes narrowing on the glowing lights of the wedding, on the flowers, the guests smiling, the music that floated softly into the night. Each laugh that rang out from across the street made her blood burn hotter. Each clap of joy felt like an insult, and she muttered under her breath that soon it would all stop. Soon they would all learn that rules could not be broken without consequence. Across the street, the couple stood hand in hand, exchanging vows while the guests smiled warmly, unaware that danger was already on its way, unaware that a phone call made in spite and jealousy had set wheels in motion that could change their night forever. The neighbors closest to Karen's house had seen her at the window, seen her lips moving quickly into the phone, and though they couldn't hear her words, they knew what she was doing, because this wasn't the first time she had called the police for nonsense. They shook their heads quietly, whispering to one another about how far she had gone this time, about how shameful it was to ruin a wedding just because she wasn't invited, but none dared to stop her, none dared to speak against her openly. Karen sat back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the wooden armrest, her face glowing with anticipation. She thought of herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, the one who enforced order, but deep down she was nothing more than bitter, a woman whose own life was so empty that she filled the silence with other people's misery. She pictured herself later, telling the HOA board how she had saved the street from chaos, how she had shut down a dangerous and illegal event, how once again she had proven her worth. The image filled her with pride, enough to make her laugh quietly to herself, though the laughter was sharp and hollow, more like a hiss than joy. Across the street, the bride's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke her vows. The groom's eyes glistened with tears, and the guests leaned in, hanging on every word. But Karen's mind drowned out the sound with her own fantasy. The fantasy of the moment when it would all be interrupted by sirens and flashing lights, the fantasy of victory. She didn't see love, she didn't hear promises. She only saw violations and rules broken, and she only heard the imagined wail of sirens growing closer with every second. She rose to her feet, pacing back and forth in front of the window like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. Her eyes darted down the street every few moments, looking for headlights, waiting for the first flash of red and blue to dance across the dark pavement. Each second stretched longer, her impatience twisting into muttering as she scolded the officers in her mind for not arriving sooner. telling herself that incompetence was everywhere and that if she had real authority, things would already be under control. But beneath her muttering, beneath her smugness, there was a flicker of nervousness, a small voice in the back of her mind whispering that maybe she had gone too far this time. Maybe when the truth came out, she wouldn't look like the hero she imagined. She pushed the thought away violently, clenching her jaw, convincing herself that she was right, that she was the protector of the neighborhood, that everyone else was wrong. The suspense thickened in the quiet street, neighbors still whispering in their homes, guests still smiling in the backyard, and Karen waiting with her sharp eyes locked on the celebration, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anger, certain that within minutes the peace of the wedding would shatter, and that she, standing proudly on her porch, would be the reason why the vows were still being spoken. The bride's trembling voice carrying across the glowing backyard, when faint. In the distance came a sound that did not belong to joy, a sound that sliced through the night like a warning bell, the long low wail of sirens drifting closer with each passing second. At first the guests did not notice, too wrapped in the beauty of the moment, too focused on the tears in the bride's eyes and the steady strength of the groom's voice. But soon whispers rose among the chairs, heads turning slightly, ears straining as the sound grew louder, closer, undeniable. Children looked up, confused, mothers shushed them quickly, fathers frowned, trying to keep their eyes on the couple while their minds wrestled with the noise. The neighbors watching from behind their curtains stiffened, their hearts racing, because they knew instantly what it meant. They had seen Karen at her window, had seen her lips moving into the phone, had seen her pacing like a hawk waiting for prey, and now they understood her call had been answered. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her chin raised high, her eyes glinting with triumph as the glow of red and blue lights flickered faintly at the far end of the block. She smiled to herself, already imagining the panic that would ripple through the wedding when the officers arrived, already savoring the way the music would stop, the way guests would scatter, the way joy would be replaced by fear and confusion. But inside the backyard, while the guests shifted nervously, the groom did not move, his hand held firmly around his bride's, his face calm, his eyes steady as though he had expected this, as though he knew something nobody else did. Some of the guests looked to him for reassurance, hoping to see anger or panic, but instead they saw only a strange calmness that unsettled them more, a calmness that felt almost like confidence. The violin player faltered, his notes trembling as the sirens grew louder, the sound bouncing off houses, echoing down the narrow street until it drowned out the vows completely. The bride's voice cracked as she glanced toward the noise, fear flickering across her face, but the groom gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, leaning closer to whisper something only she could hear, words that steadied her enough to hold her ground, even as her eyes filled with worry. The guests shifted, murmurs spreading quickly now, questions tumbling one over the other. Who had called? Why were the police coming here? Was the wedding in trouble? Some guessed instantly, their eyes darting toward Karen's house, where she stood with that smug smile plastered across her face, as if she were the director of the chaos about to unfold. The sirens grew louder still, flashing lights spilling into the street as police cars turned the corner slowly, their presence heavy, their engines humming like predators circling prey. Karen stepped down from her porch, standing proudly on the sidewalk, her hands on her hips, ready to greet the officers as if she were the hero of the night. The neighbors peeking from their windows whispered to one another that this time she had gone too far, that ruining a wedding was beyond cruel. But none dared to step out, none dared to speak against her, for her reach in the HOA was long and her tongue sharper than any blade. The guests began to panic quietly, some standing, some whispering to leave before things became worse. But the groom raised his hand slightly, a silent gesture that froze them in place, his calmness radiating in a way that made them hesitate, made them curious. His face betrayed no fear, no anger, only a stillness that felt heavy, powerful, as if he was holding back something larger than anyone could see. The bride looked at him again, her fear softening into trust, because she knew him better than anyone else and she recognized that expression, the one that told her he was not surprised, that he was not unprepared. The police cars slowed to a stop, their lights flashing against the houses, bathing the street in blue and red, and silence fell heavy across the wedding. Karen stepped forward eagerly, ready to deliver her complaints, her heart racing with excitement, her smile stretched wide with victory. She thought she had won. She thought she had destroyed the night. But what she didn't know was that her carefully built illusion of power was about to shatter in front of the entire neighborhood. And still, the groom did not flinch, his hand firm around his bride's, his calm stare fixed not on Karen, not on the guests, but on the flashing lights that drew nearer, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. The police cars rolled to a stop just outside the house, their flashing lights painting the quiet street in harsh red and blue, and the night that had once been filled with music and laughter now pulsed with tension. Doors opened and heavy boots stepped out, the officers standing tall in their uniforms, their radios crackling softly as they adjusted their belts and scanned the scene. Karen hurried forward with the energy of someone who believed the world revolved around her, her face glowing with smug satisfaction as she pointed dramatically toward the backyard wedding, her voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear. She told the officers this was an illegal event, that the neighborhood rules were being ignored, that the music was disturbing her peace, and that the gathering was too large to be safe. Her words spilled fast, laced with fake outrage, and she gestured wildly as though the simple wedding across the street was some kind of dangerous riot. The neighbors hiding behind their curtains shook their heads, whispering to each other that she was putting on a performance, exaggerating as she always did, but none dared to step outside, none dared to contradict her openly. The guests froze as the officers began to walk toward the backyard gate, their eyes darting nervously from the flashing lights to the bride clutching her husband's hand, her face pale and fearful, to the groom who stood tall and calm, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight, but his eyes strangely steady. The violin player lowered his instrument slowly, his hands trembling, the children clung to their parents, and whispers spread among the crowd, questions tumbling one over the other. Was the wedding going to be shut down? Would they all be forced to leave? Would this night that had been planned with so much love end in humiliation because of one bitter woman? Karen followed the officers with short, quick steps, still pointing, still ranting, her voice rising higher and sharper as if she wanted to make sure the entire neighborhood knew she had orchestrated this moment. She spoke about rules, about regulations, about her authority on the HOA board, and she demanded that the wedding be stopped immediately. The officers glanced at her, their expressions neutral, professional, but they kept moving forward, their eyes now fixed on the groom who had not moved, not spoken, only stood waiting with a strange air of quiet authority. The bride squeezed his hand, her fear obvious, but when she looked into his face, she saw no panic, no defeat, and though she didn't fully understand, that calmness steadied her heart. The guests leaned closer, whispering, trying to understand why he wasn't reacting, why he wasn't pleading or arguing. Karen smirked wider, believing his silence was surrender, believing she had broken him without lifting a finger. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and folded her arms as though she already owned the victory. But the truth was the scene was shifting in ways she could not yet see. The officers reached the edge of the backyard, their boots crunching softly on the gravel, their hands resting lightly on their belts, ready but not aggressive, their eyes sharp as they surveyed the gathering. They looked at the guests, at the decorations, at the bride trembling but holding her ground, and finally at the groom whose calm stare never wavered. For a moment, silence hung heavier than the flashing lights, and even the music had stopped, the violin resting in silence. Everyone waited, breaths held tight, for the first words from the officers. Karen opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, the groom shifted slightly, his hand releasing his bride's as he stepped forward. His calmness deepened the suspense, his silence more powerful than Karen's endless ranting, and though no one knew what he would do or say, every eye was locked on him, every ear strained to catch the moment that would decide whether the wedding ended in ruin or in a revelation that none of them would ever forget. The air was thick, every guest frozen in their chairs, every neighbor holding their breath behind curtains, every sound swallowed by the flashing red and blue lights that bathed the quiet street. The officers stood still, waiting, their eyes scanning the backyard, their hands steady on their belts, while Karen smirked from the sidewalk, convinced this was the end, convinced she had finally destroyed the night. She began to speak again, her shrill voice cutting through the silence, pointing at the decorations, at the chairs, at the guests as though they were criminals, demanding that the wedding be shut down immediately. insisting that the officers do their job. But before her words could land, the groom stepped forward slowly, his calmness sending a ripple through the crowd, his face steady, his steps measured, and in that moment the atmosphere shifted. He reached into his jacket pocket, the movement smooth and deliberate, and for a second some of the guests tensed, fearing what he was doing. But then their eyes widened as he pulled out a leather badge case and flipped it open, holding it up so that the flashing lights glinted off the gold. Gasps broke the silence like thunder rolling through the crowd. The officers straightened instantly, their neutral expressions breaking into recognition and respect as their hands left their belts and their heads dipped slightly in acknowledgement. Karen froze mid-sentence, her mouth still open, her finger still pointing. Her voice cut off as her eyes landed on the badge that declared the truth. The groom was not just an ordinary man hosting a backyard wedding. He was the police chief himself, the very authority she had tried to summon against him. The bride's lips parted in shock though her eyes quickly filled with relief and pride, her hand trembling as she pressed it against her chest. The guests erupted into whispers, their voices filled with awe, disbelief, and laughter, some shaking their heads, some smiling wide, all of them realizing that the game had just turned completely. The officers, now fully aware, greeted the groom with respect, addressing him formally, asking if there was any issue to be handled. He shook his head calmly, telling them the only disturbance had come from a false call. His voice was steady, calm, but behind it was power, the kind of authority that could silence a room without effort. Karen stumbled back a step, her face draining of color, the smugness gone, replaced by the wide eyes of someone who had just seen their world collapse. She stuttered, trying to find words, muttering that she hadn't known, that she thought there was trouble, that she was only protecting the neighborhood. Her excuses tumbled over one another, thin and desperate, as neighbors peeked from their curtains with wide eyes and quiet chuckles, some already lifting their phones to record what was happening, knowing this moment would be whispered about for years. The groom turned his gaze toward her, his calmness now carrying the weight of judgment, and he told her in a low voice that abusing emergency services was not only wrong but dangerous, and that her lies could have pulled officers away from real emergencies. His words were sharp but controlled, cutting deeper than shouting ever could. Karen's face twisted with humiliation as her own arrogance was turned against her, her posture shrinking as she realized she was the one now under authority, the one exposed, the one cornered. The guests clapped softly, not for the humiliation, but for the strength of the man who had turned a moment of cruelty into a moment of justice. The bride smiled through tears, relief flooding her face as she leaned against her husband, the man who had protected not just their wedding but their dignity. The officers remained calm, standing as silent witnesses to the truth, their presence now a shield rather than a threat. The wedding, which had hung on the edge of ruin only moments ago, was suddenly alive again with energy, whispers turning into laughter, fear turning into relief, suspense melting into awe. Karen stood rooted to the ground, her face red with shame, her body trembling with anger and fear, because in trying to destroy a wedding she had exposed herself, and in trying to call power against her neighbors she had discovered that power already lived in the house she had tried to crush. Karen's smug smile had already cracked when the badge was revealed, but now it shattered completely, leaving her pale and trembling in the glow of the flashing police lights. Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment as though her mind could not process what she had just seen. The truth that the man she had tried to humiliate was not only innocent but the police chief himself, the one who commanded the very officers she had summoned like pawns. She stumbled back a step, her arms uncrossing, her hands twitching nervously as she tried to regain her balance, not just physically but socially, her authority draining away like water through open fingers. Her eyes darted between the officers and the guests, her face burning with humiliation as whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors leaning closer to windows, phones now lifted to record, guests exchanging looks of disbelief and delight, some even chuckling quietly at the irony of it all. Karen tried to recover, forcing her lips into a shaky smile, lifting her hands as if to calm the moment, and her voice came out broken and high-pitched, insisting that it was a misunderstanding, that she had not meant to ruin anything, that she had only called out of concern for the safety of the neighborhood. She stammered about rules, about noise, about her responsibility as part of the HOA, but each word she spoke made her look smaller, weaker, more pathetic in the eyes of everyone who had once feared her sharp tongue. The officers didn't rush to her defense. Instead, they stood silent, their faces unreadable, their eyes watching her struggle, their respect directed entirely toward the groom who now stood taller than ever, his calm presence a stark contrast to Karen's frantic collapse. The groom didn't shout, didn't insult, he only shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable but heavy with quiet disappointment. And when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than anger ever could. He told her clearly that abusing 911 was a serious offense, that wasting police resources was dangerous, and that she had embarrassed not only herself but the entire neighborhood by trying to weaponize the system against something as beautiful and innocent as a wedding. His voice was calm but strong, carrying the weight of authority that silenced every whisper around them. Karen's face burned red, then drained pale again as she looked around, realizing every eye was on her, every camera phone capturing her humiliation, every guest in the backyard staring at her as though she were a fool. For years she had controlled the street with complaints, with threats, with fines, with her endless reports to the HOA, and now in one single night her power had crumbled, her reputation shattered in front of the very people she once lorded over. She tried again, her voice softer now, pleading instead of demanding, saying she hadn't known, saying she respected the chief, saying she only wanted to keep order, but her excuses sounded hollow, empty, broken. The bride held onto her husband's arm tightly, her eyes still wide from shock but now filled with satisfaction as she watched the woman who had tried to ruin their most important night crumble under the truth. The guests whispered, then began to murmur louder, some shaking their heads, some laughing openly, their fear replaced by a giddy sense of justice. The neighbors behind curtains whispered excitedly too, their phones buzzing as messages flew between them, telling each other that Karen had finally been caught, finally been exposed. Karen's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling as though the weight of the night pressed down on her shoulders. Her usual arrogance, her weapon of choice, had abandoned her completely, leaving her alone, fragile, and humiliated. She tried one last time to stand tall, lifting her chin, opening her mouth to argue again. But the groom raised his hand lightly, silencing her with a look that carried more authority than any threat. She closed her mouth immediately, her body trembling as the weight of his gaze reminded her of what she had done. In that silence, her reputation burned away, her neighbors seeing her not as the enforcer of rules but as a desperate woman who had crossed the line too far. For Karen, it was not just shock anymore, it was the beginning of her downfall, a downfall she had created with her own hands, fueled by her own jealousy, and sealed by the truth she had never expected to face. The silence that had hung over the wedding slowly shifted as the truth sank into every corner of the neighborhood, the flashing police lights no longer a threat but a shield, and the man who had stood calm through it all now revealed as the one person Karen never imagined he could be, the chief of police himself. The guests, who had sat frozen with fear, now began to murmur with relief and pride, some clapping quietly, some laughing at the irony, their joy spilling back into the night. The bride, her eyes still wet with tears, leaned against her husband with a smile trembling on her lips, not from fear but from pride in the man beside her, the man who had turned a night of sabotage into a moment of strength. The officers, who had once approached with caution, now stood relaxed, their respect directed entirely toward him, waiting only for his word. Karen, meanwhile, stood on the sidewalk, her body stiff, her face burning red, her hands twisting nervously as she looked from the chief to the officers to the crowd, realizing there was no way out, no excuse strong enough to erase what she had done. She muttered apologies again, her voice low and shaking, saying she hadn't known, saying it was all a misunderstanding, but her words fell flat, carried away by the soft laughter of neighbors who had finally seen her lose. For years she had ruled the street with complaints and threats, filing fines, calling in petty violations, making people walk on eggshells in their own homes. But now in front of everyone she had been exposed, her power broken, her authority shattered. The groom, now fully the chief in their eyes, turned slightly toward the officers and told them calmly to log the call as a false report, reminding them clearly that abusing 911 was a crime, one that could carry fines and serious consequences. Karen's eyes widened in panic as she tried to protest, shaking her head furiously, saying she didn't mean to, that she thought she had seen something suspicious, but the officers only looked at her with cold professionalism, their pens moving across notepads, their radios crackling softly as they recorded the incident. The neighbors leaned closer to their windows, whispering excitedly as the reality set in that Karen might finally face punishment for her years of harassment. The bride lifted her chin proudly now, her hand resting over her husband's, her fear completely gone as she whispered softly to him, thanking him not only for protecting their wedding but for protecting their dignity. The guests, encouraged by the shift, began to clap louder, their laughter growing, their voices carrying joy once more, drowning out the mutters of the woman who had tried to silence them. Karen stepped back slowly, her eyes darting left and right, searching for escape, for dignity, but found none, because every window held the eyes of neighbors who would never let her forget. Every phone camera held proof of her downfall. She turned quickly, retreating toward her porch, her steps fast and uneven, her face hidden behind her hands as if she could block out the humiliation, and she disappeared inside her house with the slam of a door that sounded more like defeat than retreat. The officers remained a while longer, ensuring order, but with the chief present, their role was more symbolic than needed, because his quiet authority had already restored control. Slowly, the sirens faded as the cars drove away, the flashing lights disappearing down the street, leaving the neighborhood under the soft golden glow of the wedding lights once more. The music returned, the violinist lifting his bow with a smile of relief, the guests rising to their feet with cheers, louder than ever, clapping and laughing as the couple stood again beneath the flowered arch. The vows continued, stronger now, carried not only by love but by the strength of a moment that no one would ever forget. The neighbors behind their curtains watched quietly, some smiling to themselves, some whispering in or that the very man Karen had tried to destroy had turned out to be untouchable. The kind of man no HOA rule, no petty complaint, no bitter neighbor could ever break. The bride and groom sealed their vows with a kiss, and the crowd erupted with joy, applause rolling across the yard, drowning out every trace of Karen's attempt to ruin them. That night, the wedding did not just unite two hearts, it united a neighborhood, showing everyone that sometimes those who try hardest to destroy happiness only end up destroying themselves. And though Karen stayed hidden behind her curtains, her pride broken, her name whispered with laughter, the couple danced under the golden lights with smiles brighter than ever, their love untouchable, their joy unstoppable, and their story a warning to anyone who thought power built on cruelty could last forever.